4 engineers had already been walked off the tarmac by the time the mechanic in the frayed coverall started toward the engine, and nobody at Northcott Field thought to stop him, because nobody imagined he was worth stopping. $2 billion sat on the wing behind him, silent as a held breath. 9 days from an investor deadline that would decide whether Ashby Aerodyne built airplanes for another decade or became a cautionary footnote in someone else's quarterly filing. The demonstrator had failed catastrophic testing 3 times. 3 times the compressor had spun up, screamed toward its rated pressure, and gone dead in the same 11 seconds. And 3 times a team of men with doctorates and consulting fees larger than his annual salary had stood around it with laptops and found nothing. Genevieve Ashby watched him come, this man in navy coveralls with a collar gone soft and frayed at the seam, a name patch that read only E. Sawyer, Line Tech. And she felt the particular embarrassment of a woman who has just watched someone send the wrong person to do an impossible job. He did not look at her. He did not look at anyone. He walked the last 10 feet to the engine the way a man walks toward a door he has opened 1,000 times before, and he set his palm flat against the housing, unhurried, as if checking for a fever. Then he tapped it. Once, twice. A 3rd time, low, near the base of the casing, and knelt on the tarmac in his work boots, and pressed his ears so close to the metal that a junior engineer near the tail let out a laugh he didn't quite swallow in time. Why would a line mechanic tap a dead multi-million-dollar engine 3 times like he was checking a heartbeat? And why does the billionaire watching him look like she recognizes something she can't place? Genevieve did not laugh. She checked her watch instead, the way she did when something in a room refused to make sense to her on the first pass, and told herself it was nothing, a tick, a habit some mechanics had, meaningless as a man cracking his knuckles before a coin flip. But some old, unexamined part of her, the part that had grown up in hangars before she'd grown up in boardrooms, recognized the gesture the way you recognize a voice in another room before you can place whose it is. She did not know yet that she was looking at the answer to a question her own company had spent 6 years making sure no one would ever think to ask. She did not know that the man kneeling on her tarmac had once written the very numbers her engineers were failing to reproduce. All she knew, standing there in her tailored coat with 4 fired consultant severance paperwork still warm in her assistant's folder, was that the mechanic's eyes had drifted shut, and that whatever he was listening for, he seems to already know where to find it. Stay to the end for the 7 minutes that changed everything on that tarmac, and the 6 years it took to explain why. 6 hours earlier, in a small rented house 11 miles from Northcott Field, none of this had announced itself. The kitchen light was the only one on. Emmett Sawyer stood at the counter in sock feet, folding a paper towel around a sandwich cut into 2 even triangles, because Josie had informed him at some point in the last year that uneven triangles were for people who didn't care, and he had never cared to argue the point.
The lunchbox was purple, with a cloud sticker on the lid that she'd chosen herself from a sheet of a dozen options at the drugstore, agonizing over it with the seriousness of a woman selecting a wedding ring, and he'd learned not to suggest the rocket ship instead. Behind him, propped against the toaster, where he'd see it every morning whether he wanted to or not, was a photograph of Mary Ann laughing at something just outside the frame. Her hair still short from the last round of treatment, taken the spring before she died, when Josie was 4 and didn't yet understand what the doctor's quiet voices meant. Emmett didn't look at the photograph long. He never did. Looking long wasn't the same as loving well, and he'd made his peace with that distinction a long time ago, the way you make peace with a splinter too deep to dig out without doing more damage than leaving it. His toolbox sat by the back door where it always sat, and before he picked it up, he opened the lid the way another man might check his phone, and read the drawing taped inside it. A child's crayon rendering of an engine, all orange flame and blue smoke, wheels where a jet has none. Because Josie had been 6 when she drew it,
and had informed him with total confidence that all engines needed wheels to run properly. He'd never corrected her. He read it every morning the way he'd once read flight test data, carefully, in full, before closing the lid. 2 knocks, he said, and Josie appeared in the doorway in one sock, hair still flattened on one side from the pillow, and knocked twice on the doorframe in reply. Because that was the rule they'd built without ever discussing it, the rule that meant I'm here and needed nothing else attached to it. Routine call, he told her, which was true as far as he knew. A private airfield, a maintenance contractor short a body. Decent pay for the day. He kissed the top of her head, told her Mrs. Odom would walk her to school, same as always, and drove out past the last stretch of frost-killed cornfields toward Northcott Field, with the radio off, the way he always drove, listening to nothing but the engine of his own aging truck, which ran, as it happened, exactly the way he expected it to. He did not know, pulling into the visitor lot, that he was about to walk toward a machine that carried his own handwriting inside it, forgotten by everyone except him. The site manager at the gate looked at his paperwork, looked at his coveralls, and waved him toward the hangar without much thought, the way you wave through a delivery truck. It was the engineering lead, a compact, precise man named Miles Odell, who intercepted him on the tarmac itself, clipboard in hand, already saying something about needing another set of hands to run cable, before he registered that Emmett wasn't carrying any of the tools that would suggest cable running was in his future. By then, Genevieve Ashby had already turned from the dead engine and was walking toward them both, coat snapping faintly in the wind coming off the runway. And it was to her that Odell said, apologetically, "I think dispatch sent the wrong tech." "I think dispatch sent someone," Genevieve said, not unkindly, though not warmly either, in the flat and efficient tone of a woman who had learned early that warmth in a professional setting was often mistaken for weakness. She looked at Emmett the way she looked at most things now, quickly, for information rather than for long. And what she saw was a faded name patch, boots gone soft in the toe, hands that hung loose and easy at his sides in a way that struck her fleetingly as strange for a man about to be told he wasn't needed. "We asked for a propulsion engineer. Ashby Aerodyne has 4 of the best in the industry standing on this tarmac right now, and none of them can explain why that engine dies at 11 seconds every single time we run it. I don't need a parts runner. I need someone who can read a compressor map." She said it loudly enough that the assembled engineers, still clustered near the wingtip with their laptops open to diagnostic trees that led nowhere, could hear every word. And a few of them exchanged the kind of look people exchange when a joke has been made at someone else's expense, but no one wants to be the first to laugh. "Numbers don't lie," Genevieve added, the way she always did before dismissal. An old habit inherited from boardrooms rather than hangars. And checked her watch, though nothing about the moment required the time. "Send him back to whatever depot he came from, and get me somebody who actually designs these things." Emmett didn't argue. He didn't explain himself, didn't produce credentials he technically no longer possessed on paper, didn't so much as raise his voice above the pitch he'd have used to ask for a socket wrench. He looked past her at the engine itself, cold and silent under its cowling in the flat morning light, and said only, 5 minutes. If I'm wrong, I'll carry cable the rest of the day." It was Odell, not Genevieve, who answered, mostly because the board's emergency call was 4 days closer than anyone wanted to say aloud, and the alternative was calling in a 5th consulting firm at a rate that would make the 4th quarter numbers even uglier than they already were. 5 minutes, Odell said, and Genevieve's silence, which might have been read as permission, or might simply have been read as a woman deciding it wasn't worth the argument, was enough. Odell pushed the diagnostic laptop toward him anyway, screen already open to the failure logs from all 3 runs. Red flags stacked one after another down a column of green. Emmett glanced at it the way a man glances at a menu in a restaurant he's eaten at 100 times, and set it gently, deliberately, on the equipment cart beside him. Screen still glowing, untouched. "I'll want that if the tap doesn't tell me anything," he said, which was not quite an insult and not quite reassurance either, and walked the full circumference of the engine instead, slow, hands loose, the way another man might walk the perimeter of a house he was thinking of buying. He stopped at 4 points along the housing and rested his palm flat against each one in turn, eyes half closing a beat before his hand made contact, as though the seeing had to stop before the feeling could start. Genevieve checked her watch again, a full 90 seconds into his 5 minutes, and one of the younger engineers, a woman named Cordelia Radcliffe, who had said nothing since the first mocking exchange, watched him with an attention that had nothing sarcastic in it at all. Near the compressor housing, where the cowling had been pulled back for the third failed test, Emmett's hand slowed and stopped over a line of rivets set slightly closer together than the pattern running the rest of the casing. An inconsistency so small that 3 teams of engineers with instruments far more precise than a human palm had looked directly at it and never registered it as anything but factory tolerance. He did not say anything about it yet. He only pressed 2 fingers against it, the way a doctor might press against a bruise to ask a patient where it hurt. And something in his face changed, briefly, in a way none of the watching engineers could have named, because none of them had ever put those rivets there themselves.
"Is he listening to it?" Odell asked no one in particular, not quite masking the disbelief in his voice. And Genevieve didn't answer, because she was watching Emmett kneel again at the base of the casing. And for the second time that morning, she felt the strange, groundless sensation of recognizing something she could not place, like a smell from a childhood house carried on a stranger's coat. At 4 minutes and 40 seconds, Emmett stood, dusted his palms once against his coveralls, and said, without any theater in it at all, "Run the ignition bypass on channel 4, override the primary compressor sensor, and give me control of the secondary fuel valve manually. I'll want someone at the panel who can hold a steady hand for about 7 minutes." Odell opened his mouth to explain, patiently, that Channel 4 hadn't been active on this engine's architecture in years, that the manual override existed only in legacy documentation nobody at the company had looked at since before he'd been hired, and then stopped, because something in the specificity of the request, the ease with which this stranger and a frayed collar had named a system that should have been invisible to him, made the explanation feel suddenly beside the point. "Do it," Genevieve said, mostly, though she would not have admitted this even to herself, because she wanted to see him fail on the record rather than be quietly proven right off it. Emmett knelt at the housing a final time, in the exact posture from an hour before, and tapped the casing 3 times, low, near the base, the same rhythm, the same unhurried certainty, and pressed his ear against the metal as if listening for something underneath the something everyone else had already given up hearing. Then he stood, walked to the fuel valve, and began to work. Odell called out the time without meaning to, the way a man narrates his own disbelief to keep from having to feel it fully. 2 minutes. A hiss of pressurized air, the compressor beginning its slow spin-up, the sound thin and tentative at first, like a question. 4 minutes. The engine's pitch rose, climbed past the 11-second mark where it had died 3 times before, kept climbing, and Genevieve's hand had gone still on her wrist, watch forgotten. 6 minutes, 40 seconds. And then, at 7 minutes exactly, the engine caught fully. A deep and even roar rolling out across the tarmac, steady, sustained, correct. And the silence that followed it inside the small crowd of engineers was more total than any silence the morning had produced yet. Because it was the silence of people recalculating everything they had assumed about the man standing in front of them. "The compressor architecture is mine," Emmett said, quietly, not to the crowd so much as to the engine itself, the way a man might introduce 2 old friends. "I designed it 6 years ago, before the merger." He didn't say it as an accusation. He didn't say it as a claim to anything at all. He said it the way he might have stated the time,
or the weather, and let it sit there, exact and unadorned, while the engine ran on behind him, steady as a pulse. Genevieve's eyes had gone to his collar, where a thin shoelace disappeared beneath the fabric, and to the small, scorched brass tag hanging from it, half visible, a compressor tag from some decommissioned engine long since scrapped. She had seen a tag like that before. Not this one, but its shape, its worn brass edge, in a box of her late father's old files. She had gone through only once, quickly, unable to stay in the room with them for long, and had never opened again. She could not, standing there with the engine's roar still hanging in the air, place exactly why the sight of it made her chest tighten the way it did. But something in her recognized it the way you recognize a name you've heard only once, years ago, in passing, from someone you loved. The engine ran clean for 2 days. It held every benchmark Ashby Aerodyne's test protocol demanded, and for 2 days the mood inside the company shifted the way weather shifts, imperceptibly and then completely. Engineers who had laughed on the tarmac now finding excuses to walk past the hangar and watch it idle. Then, on the morning of the 3rd day, a second demonstrator engine, one Emmett had never touched, never inspected, never so much as walked past, failed in the exact same way at the exact same 11-second mark, as though the fault had simply relocated itself to prove a point nobody wanted proven. The board convened an emergency call within the hour. 4 days, they told Genevieve, flat and final. Explain the failure, fix it permanently, or the investor demonstration would be canceled outright and the entire jet program would be shelved before it ever left the ground. $2 billion quietly folded back into a filing that would read, in the driest possible language, as the end of her father's company. It was Genevieve herself, not Odell, who found Emmett in the hangar that evening and asked him, without the flatness she'd used on the tarmac, to look at the specification records. He hadn't asked for access. She hadn't offered it easily. But something about watching a second engine die in a way her own engineers could not explain had put a crack in the certainty she wore the way other people wore a coat. And she signed the clearance herself rather than rooted through anyone who might ask why. He found the discrepancy within an hour, seated at a workbench with a stack of specification printouts and a coffee gone cold beside him, tracing the compressor alloy's part number back through 6 years of maintenance records, with the patient, unhurried attention of a man reading a letter from someone he used to know. The number didn't match anything he had ever signed off on, not close. Not a rounding difference, not a supplier substitution logged and approved the way such things sometimes were. An entirely different alloy, cheaper, lighter, rated for tolerances that looked identical on paper and behaved differently by exactly 11 seconds under sustained pressure. He sat with that fact for a long moment, the coffee cooling further, before he said anything to her at all. "This isn't a design flaw," he said finally, turning the printout so she could see it. "This is a part that was never supposed to be in that engine." Genevieve looked at the number and then at the date stamped beside it. 6 years old. The same year her father had dissolved the division this compressor had come from. The same year Emmett Sawyer had walked out of Ashby Aerodyne's records as though he had never designed anything at all. Thaddeus Winthrop arrived 2 mornings later, an old propulsion auditor with a government badge long retired and a memory that hadn't retired with it. A man Emmett had worked alongside before the merger and hadn't seen since. He spread the archived design records across a conference table with the unhurried care of someone handling something he'd once thought lost for good. And within an hour, the 3 of them, Winthrop, Emmett, Genevieve, had traced the substitution back through 6 years of procurement approvals, each one signed off under an authority that read, in a cramped and hurried hand, E. Sawyer. "I never signed any of these," Emmett said quietly, looking at his own name written in a hand that wasn't his, the loops too tight, the S formed wrong. A forgery close enough to fool an auditor in a hurry, but not close enough to fool the man whose signature it claimed to be. It was Genevieve who kept looking, though, long after Emmett had said what he needed to say, because something about the date of the earliest substitution nagged at her the way the brass tag had nagged at her on the tarmac. She pulled the original merger paperwork herself that night, alone in her father's old office, boxes she hadn't opened since his funeral, and found, beneath the forged signature bearing Emmett's name, a second signature on the authorizing memo, one she recognized instantly, because she had grown up watching him sign things at the kitchen table. Her father's counter-signature, dated and witnessed, approving a division dissolution and a cost restructuring that named, as its administrator, a man named Roland Kessler. She sat with that a long time before she understood what it meant. Kessler had not simply forged Emmett's name to hide a substitution. He had forged it under her own father's authority, using a signature her father would have trusted implicitly for 6 straight years, because the one man who might have noticed the discrepancy had already been erased from the company's memory, and the one man who might have asked her father directly was dead and could no longer be asked anything at all. The betrayal, she understood now, sitting alone in an office that still smelled faintly of her father's aftershave 4 years after his death, had never come from the mechanic in the frayed coveralls. It had been living inside her own inherited company the entire time, wearing her father's name like a mask. The boardroom on the 7th day was fuller than it had been in months, every seat occupied. The investor call now folded into an internal reckoning nobody had planned for. Genevieve stood at the head of the table with the falsified procurement records in one hand and the original design specifications, Emmett's specifications, in the other, and laid them side by side on the polished surface for every executive in the room to see. 6 years ago, my father's company lost a propulsion engineer it should never have lost, she said, and her voice did not waver the way a lesser apology wavers, because she had rehearsed nothing and needed to rehearse nothing. The facts, laid flat on the table, did the work that speeches usually tried and failed to do. In his absence, someone substituted a cheaper alloy into every compressor we've built since, forged his signature to hide the cost difference he pocketed, and let the company believe our own designs were failing us. They weren't. The design was correct. The company simply stopped looking at the man who wrote it. She did not name Kessler yet, not in that sentence, because the naming had already happened, quietly, procedurally, in a legal referral drawn up that morning without ceremony. I offer Mr. Sawyer a director's title, full compensation for 6 years of unaccredited design work, and permanent authorship credit on every engine this company builds going forward. Emmett listened to all of it, with his hands loose at his sides, the way he'd stood on the tarmac. And when she finished, he said only, "I don't want the title." A pause, long enough that a few of the executives shifted in their chairs, uncertain whether the silence meant refusal or negotiation. "File the original design under my name in the permanent record. That's all. And start a fund, an honest one, with real oversight, for line techs and apprentices, the kind of people who get let go quietly when a division folds and nobody thinks to ask where their names went." He looked, briefly, toward the 4 engineers who had been walked off the tarmac 9 days before, still employed, still present, watching him now with an attention that had nothing left of mockery in it. Some of them are still standing in this building. Most people who get erased aren't so lucky. Later, in the hallway outside, with the boardroom emptying behind them, Winthrop fell into step beside him and asked, in the plain way old colleagues ask things they already suspect the answer to, whether he'd ever thought about coming back to the work full-time. Whether any of this changed what he wanted his life to look like. "Marianne kept every drawing Josie ever made me," Emmett said, not quite answering the question, or answering it more fully than Winthrop had asked it. even the ones of engines she didn't understand. She said a man should know his daughter watched him work. He said it plainly, without weight added to it, the way he said most things. And Winthrop, who had known him before the merger and had wondered, in his own quiet way, what had become of him since, understood that this was the only answer he was going to get, and that it was a complete one. 3 months later, the demonstrator flew. It lifted off Northcott Field's main runway on a clear morning, with the investor delegation watching from the tarmac where, months before, a mechanic in a frayed coverall had knelt to listen to a dying engine no one else could hear. And it climbed, steady and correct, exactly the way Emmett Sawyer had designed it to climb 6 years before anyone thought to ask his name. A small plaque had been mounted near the hangar entrance by then, unshowy, the kind of thing you could walk past without noticing unless you already knew to look, listing the compressor architecture's original designer beside the date of its first working prototype. Roland Kessler was gone from the company by then too, quietly. The falsified procurement records handed off to auditors in a process that took considerably less time to complete than it had taken Emmett to be believed. And nobody in the boardroom spoke of it again, beyond what the legal filings required.
Emmett went back to the line the following week because he'd asked to, and because Genevieve had learned, by then, not to argue with him about what he wanted.
In the small workshop behind his rented house, where Josie's crayon drawing now hung framed above the workbench instead of folded into a toolbox lid, he took the scorched brass compressor tag from around his neck one evening and clipped it gently onto a new lanyard beside a laminated print of that same drawing. Orange flame, blue smoke. Wheels where a jet has none. He did not take it off the next morning. He wore it under his collar the way he always had, past the counter where Mary Ann's photograph still stood catching the early light, out the door and down the hallway to Josie's room, where he knocked twice, the way he always did, never 3, and waited for the 2 knocks that came back through the door before he ever turned the handle. If you've ever been the one nobody thought to ask, tell us the moment someone finally did.